The Realtors stole their house, and their neighbors laughed when they were left with nothing. But the family didn't give up. They built a new house on their ancestors' land, made of concrete, faith, and love. Subscribe and write which city you're from. The last time Andrew Rivers stood on the porch of his house, the morning light was gentle, stretching across the wooden steps he had built with his own hands. It had always been more than a house to him. It was proof of a life built from effort, from calloused hands and sleepless nights, from the way his wife Clara smiled each time she came home, and the sound of his son Jake's laughter echoing through the halls. But that morning, as he stood there holding a letter from the realtor, the same place suddenly felt smaller, fragile, and strangely unfamiliar. The paper trembled slightly in his hand as he read the words again. "We regret to inform you that the ownership transfer has been finalized. There was no mention of payment, no trace of the money they were promised. Only the cold, final tone of legality." The day was hot, but Andrew felt a chill crawling up his arms. He looked at Clara, who stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, trying to mask her fear behind that calm, measured look she always wore when life demanded strength. Their 10-year-old son stood beside her, confused, watching his father's silence. Jake didn't understand words like fraud or ownership transfer. All he knew was that the grown-ups who had promised to sell their home had vanished, and now his parents were whispering about lawyers and lost savings. By evening, the house was no longer theirs. Men in suits arrived with papers and polite voices. They asked the family to leave while they sorted out the details. Andrew didn't argue. There was no energy left for anger. He walked through each room one last time, touching the walls he had sanded and painted himself, the wooden table he had built from leftover beams, the little marks on the kitchen doorframe where Jake's height had been measured year after year. He lingered longest there, tracing the faded pencil lines with his fingers. Clara stood quietly behind him, her eyes glistening but dry. They had both seen storms before, but never one that took their home. That night, they slept in their truck by the side of a road. The air was thick with dust and the smell of oil. Jake curled up between them, his small backpack serving as a pillow. Clara stared through the windshield into the darkness, her thoughts moving too fast for sleep. Andrew sat in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel long after the engine had gone cold. He tried to think of the next step, of the court, of the authorities, of someone who might still help them, but every plan dissolved before it even took shape. The realization came slowly, painfully. They were on their own. Days turned into weeks. The family moved from one temporary place to another. Sometimes they stayed near construction sites, where Andrew picked up small repair jobs, painting fences, patching roofs, anything that kept his hands busy. He told Clara it was just until things clear up. She nodded, though both knew there was no quick fix. The legal system was a maze, and their money was gone. At night, they slept in the back of a rusty van that once served as Andrew's work vehicle. Clara tried to make it livable. She hung a curtain over the back window, laid out blankets, and turned an old crate into a table. But even in her quiet efficiency, there was an exhaustion she could no longer hide. Jake didn't complain. He was young enough to adapt, old enough to notice the tension in his parents' voices. He began filming short clips on his small phone camera, his father hammering nails, his mother stirring soup over a portable stove. He said he was making a movie about how people survive. Sometimes his laughter broke through the stillness, and for a brief moment, the world seemed normal again. Andrew tried to hold on to that sound. It reminded him of what was still intact, their family, their stubborn will to keep moving forward. But he also knew that each passing day chipped away at their pride. The man who used to build homes for others now slept in the shadow of unfinished ones. Sometimes, on his way to a job, he passed by neighborhoods where new houses were rising fast, built by younger crews with better tools. He used to be one of them, respected and reliable. Now he kept his head down, doing small tasks for half his worth. Clara found work 2 waiting tables in a roadside diner. She didn't talk much about it, but the smell of fried food clung to her clothes when she returned each night. She'd count the tips quietly while Andrew sat beside her, going over the numbers of what they needed to buy just to get through another week. Neither of them spoke about the future anymore. One evening, after another long day, they drove without a destination, just to escape the noise of passing trucks. Jake slept in the back, and Clara stared out the window, lost in thought. "We can't keep doing this," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "We need somewhere that's ours, even if it's nothing more than dirt and air." Andrew didn't answer right away. His mind drifted to the past, to summers long ago when he was a boy, and his grandfather had taken him to a small piece of land outside the city. There had been an old well, a leaning fence, and a single oak tree. He hadn't thought of that place in years. The next morning, he searched through a box of old papers he'd kept from his grandfather. Amid the yellowed receipts and fading photographs, he found a folded deed barely legible, but still official. The land was still theirs, passed down through the family but long forgotten. It wasn't much, just a few acres on the edge of what had once been farmland. But now, after decades of expansion, the area was surrounded by new developments. They drove there the same afternoon. The road was rough and overgrown with weeds, but when they finally arrived, the air felt different, cleaner, quieter. The place was wild and unkempt, yet there was a strange peace about it. The oak tree was still there, its branches heavy and full. The old well was covered with boards, but it hadn't collapsed. Clara stepped out of the car and looked around. "It's beautiful," she whispered, though the word felt strange after months of displacement. Andrew walked across the dry grass, touching the rough bark of the oak. He could almost see his grandfather's hands, weathered and steady, showing him how to tie ropes, how to measure boards, how to trust the work of your own arms. He turned back to Clara and said, "This is where we start again." She hesitated. "Start what?" "There's nothing here." "There's us," he said simply. "And that's enough." They spent the rest of the day clearing a small patch of ground near the tree. Jake ran around collecting sticks for a fire. When the sun dipped below the hills, the sky turned gold, then deep blue. The family sat together by the fire, eating what little food they had, wrapped in blankets against the cool wind. Clara leaned her head against Andrew's shoulder, and for the first time in months, they didn't talk about loss. Andrew looked into the flames, thinking about the future, not the distant kind, but the immediate one, the kind that could be shaped by his own hands. He imagined walls rising again, a roof that could hold against the rain, a door that opened to warmth instead of uncertainty. "We'll build something here," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Maybe not like before, but something that lasts." Jake poked at the fire with a stick and looked up. "Can I help?" he asked. Andrew smiled. "You already are." That night, the stars stretched wide across the sky, the firelight flickering on their tired faces. The air was still and heavy with promise. They didn't know what kind of home they would build, or how long it would take, but they knew one thing. They had found their ground again. And for Andrew, that was enough. The sound of the wind through the oak branches was like a whisper from the past, a reminder that everything built once could be built again. As the embers faded, he lay awake, feeling the earth beneath him. It was rough, uneven, and full of stones, but it was theirs. He turned his head slightly and saw Clara and Jake asleep beside him. The moon cast a faint glow across their faces. For the first time since they lost their house, Andrew didn't feel like a man without a home. He felt like a man standing at the beginning of something. Something that would rise again, not from money or luck, but from the same quiet, unyielding faith that had carried his family through every storm before. And somewhere inside that fragile piece, a new idea began to take shape, one that would soon turn that forgotten patch of land into the heart of their rebirth. The morning after that night by the fire, Andrew woke to the sound of birds nesting somewhere in the oak tree above. The ground beneath his back was cold and uneven, but it was a different kind of discomfort, one that carried promise rather than despair. The light filtered through the branches, falling across Clara and Jake as they slept, their faces soft in the dawn. For a moment, he simply watched them and felt something he hadn't known in months, the slow, steady rhythm of peace. The world hadn't given them much lately, but this small piece of earth felt like a hand reaching back from the past, inviting them to start again. By the time Clara woke, Andrew was already walking the perimeter of the land, measuring invisible lines with his eyes, tracing the curve of a future foundation. When she joined him, still wrapped in a blanket, he pointed to a spot near the old well and said quietly, "This is where we'll build." She followed his gaze, the wind lifting her hair. "Build what, Andrew? A shed? A cabin?" He turned to her, eyes steady. "A home. Maybe not like before, but one that will hold." The simplicity of his voice left no room for doubt. Clara said nothing, only looked at the earth, where weeds tangled through broken stones, imagining walls rising where there was now emptiness. It seemed impossible, but then again, so had everything else they had endured. She reached for his hand, their fingers closing in a quiet pact. The days that followed were filled with work. They had no money to hire help, no machines to dig or lift, only their own hands and a battered set of tools that had survived the chaos of their loss. Andrew cleared the land with a shovel and an axe, cutting through the overgrowth, while Jake carried branches away to pile them into small bonfires. Clara cleaned the old well, clearing leaves and stones, discovering that water still shimmered faintly below. It was a good sign, Andrew said, proof that something still ran deep beneath their ground. In the evenings, they cooked over the fire, sitting close to keep warm. Jake recorded everything with his small phone camera, narrating like a reporter. "Day 3, he said one evening, holding the camera toward the firelight. "We're still here. Mom found water. Dad says we'll have walls soon." Andrew smiled at that, though he knew how far they still had to go. He didn't want to tell Jake that the money in his pocket barely covered more than a few bags of cement. Then, one afternoon while resting under the tree, he stumbled upon an article on his old phone about dome-shaped houses made of concrete. The idea seemed strange at first, a round shelter, almost like a shell. But as he read further, he realized it was exactly what they needed. Strong, affordable, resistant to wind and time. It was a shape that didn't fight against the earth, but rose naturally from it. When he told Clara that night, her brow furrowed in doubt. "Like a bunker?" she asked softly, stirring their soup with a stick. "More like a seed," Andrew said. "If we build it right, it'll last longer than we will." She gave a small, uncertain laugh. "A house that looks like a seed. That's a new one." He smiled back. "Then maybe it's time we try something new." The next day, Andrew began sketching on an old piece of plywood with charcoal. His hands, though rough and tired, moved with the certainty of someone who had found purpose again. Clara watched him from across the fire, seeing in his movements the same quiet fire that had drawn her to him years ago. For the first time in months, There was a light in his eyes that wasn't made of regret. They gathered what materials they could find. Andrew scavenged from old construction sites, leftover bags of cement, pieces of rebar, wooden boards for framing. Sometimes the workers let him take the scraps. Other times, he traded his labor for them. Jake helped carry each load, proud of his strength, calling it our secret treasure hunt. Clara, meanwhile, turned their campsite into something resembling a home. She washed their clothes in the well, cooked meals from whatever they had, and even made a small garden patch near the edge of the property. The first attempt at mixing concrete was a disaster. The ratio was wrong, and by morning, the surface had cracked like dry clay. Andrew cursed under his breath, feeling the familiar sting of failure. But before he could throw away the tools, Jake came running from behind the tree, holding the camera up. "Say something, Dad! Like, how do you feel when the house cracks?" Andrew stared at him for a long moment, then laughed, an unexpected sound that echoed off the empty lot. "I feel like it's testing me," he said finally, "and I'm not done yet." They tried again. And again. The days blurred into a rhythm of labor, mixing, pouring, lifting, resting. Each mistake taught them something: the right angle of the frame, the right time to let the cement breathe. Clara joined in too, smoothing the walls with a trowel, her movements patient and steady. She hummed softly as she worked, and her voice filled the space between them like music. As the shape began to take form, neighbors from the new housing developments nearby started to notice. They drove by slowly, watching from behind tinted windows. Some stopped to stare openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "What are they building?" Andrew heard one man whisper. "Looks like a spaceship," another laughed, "or a bunker for the end of the world." The words reached Jake, who came running to his parents with anger in his eyes. "They're laughing at us," he said. "They think we're crazy." Andrew knelt beside him, wiping the dust from the boy's cheek. "Let them laugh," he said softly. "They'll see soon enough that this is no bunker. This is our beginning." Jake nodded, though his lips were pressed tight. That evening, he recorded another video. "People laugh," he said to the camera. "But maybe that's because they've never had to build hope from the ground up." As summer deepened, the air grew heavy and humid. Each day's work left them drenched in sweat. But the dome began to rise steadily, layer by layer. Andrew's hands grew raw and blistered. Clara's arms burned by the sun, but neither complained. Every evening they sat under the oak, watching the concrete dry under the fading light. Jake began calling it the Heartbeat House because of the way echoes bounced inside when they spoke. Then came the storm. It rolled in suddenly one afternoon, the sky turning from pale gold to an angry gray. The wind howled through the unfinished dome, shaking the wooden supports. Rain fell in violent sheets, drenching everything. They scrambled to cover what they could, but by nightfall, half the structure had collapsed under the weight of water. The walls cracked again, this time deeper, and the small space that had begun to feel like home was reduced to fragments of wet cement. Clara sat under the tree, her hands over her face, whispering, "I can't do this anymore." The sound of her crying cut through Andrew like glass. For the first time since they had begun, he felt his resolve waver. He stared at the broken shell of the dome, his throat tight, his eyes burning from exhaustion. Then, through the rain, Jake approached. The boy's clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked up at his father with the same steady eyes that Andrew once saw in the mirror of his own youth. "Maybe it means the house wants to see how much we care," Jake said quietly. Andrew blinked, the words catching him off guard. He turned his head toward the half-collapsed frame and felt something stir inside him again, a stubbornness, a quiet defiance. Then we'll show it, he murmured. Through the rest of the night, they worked under flashes of lightning, propping up fallen boards, mixing more cement, shoring up what the storm had undone. Clara joined them after a while, still trembling but resolute. The rain eased toward dawn, and when the first light broke over the hills, the dome still stood damaged, but standing. The next days were quieter. They moved more slowly, careful not to rush. The rhythm returned, but this time it was gentler, guided by patience rather than urgency. Clara began painting the inside walls a soft, pale color, saying it would help them forget the grayness outside. Jake drew with chalk on the lower part of the wall small houses, stick figures, and the words, "Our home." Weeks passed, and the dome was finally sealed. Inside, the air felt cool and still, and when they spoke, their voices echoed faintly, as though the walls themselves were listening. The floor was bare concrete, the windows small and round, the doorway framed with salvaged wood. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, they lit a fire outside and ate supper together on the ground. The dome glowed faintly in the fading light, smooth and silver like a giant stone half buried in the earth. Andrew looked at it and felt an ache in his chest, a mix of exhaustion, pride, and disbelief. Clara leaned against him, her voice soft. "It's small," she said. "It's strong," he replied. Jake added, grinning, "And it's round. That means the wind can't push it over." They laughed together, the sound warm and easy. For the first time in months, there was no tension between them, no talk of what they had lost or what they still lacked. Only the quiet contentment of something earned, something real. As the stars appeared, Andrew walked inside the dome alone. The faint light from the fire danced across the walls, and for a moment he stood still, listening to his footsteps echo in the round space. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a statement, a promise that they were still standing, still capable of creating beauty from ruin. He placed his hand on the cool concrete and whispered, "We did it." Behind him, Clara's laughter floated in with the night breeze, and Jake's voice joined hers. The dome caught their echoes and carried them softly across its walls, as if the house itself was breathing with them. Outside, the oak tree rustled in the wind, and the faint smell of wet earth arose through the air. The family gathered once more around the fire before heading to sleep inside their new home. As Andrew lay down, he thought about how the walls curved above them, seamless and solid, shaped by their labor and held together by something stronger than cement faith. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic sound of the night insects beyond the dome. Tomorrow, he would think about doors, about floors, about the next stage. But for now, he let the warmth of the fire and the steady breath of his family lull him into sleep, content in the quiet truth that their house born from the earth, molded by their hands, was alive. The days after the dome was finished carried a strange calm. The family woke each morning to sunlight slipping through the small round windows, spreading across the curved walls like the first brushstroke of a new painting. The space echoed softly when they moved, as if the house was whispering back to them, alive with every breath they took. Clara began to sweep the floor each morning, humming under her breath. Jake would run his hand along the smooth walls before heading outside to fetch water from the well, proud of how cool the concrete felt beneath his palm. Andrew often stood in the doorway at dawn, staring at the hills in silence. Still unsure whether to believe what they had built was real. The wind carried the scent of rain, but for once he wasn't afraid of it. The storms could come. The house would stand. It was on one of those quiet mornings that something unexpected happened. Jake had uploaded another one of his videos, this time showing the final moments of construction, the sunrise glinting off the drying dome, his parents laughing by the fire, his voice behind the camera saying, "We built this with our hands." He didn't expect anyone to see it, but within days, messages began to flood in. Strangers from other towns and even other countries were leaving comments, calling them inspiring, asking how they had done it. The video spread fast, shared by people who saw in it not just a house, but proof that rebuilding was still possible. Andrew didn't notice at first. He wasn't the kind of man to keep track of online things. But one evening, as they sat by the fire, Jake showed him the screen, glowing with numbers he didn't understand. "Look," Jake said, excitement trembling in his voice. "Dad, there are thousands of people watching us." Clara leaned closer, squinting at the endless scroll of messages. "They're saying we gave them hope," she whispered. Andrew said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked at the little screen, the faces of his family lit by its faint blue light, and then he smiled faintly. Then maybe all of this was worth something after all. The next week brought visitors. At first it was just curious neighbors, those who had once laughed from their porches, now stopped by the dirt path, asking questions. They walked around the dome, touching its walls, surprised by how solid and cool it felt. "You really built this yourselves?" one woman asked, disbelief in her voice. Andrew nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Every inch." Soon, word spread further. A journalist arrived one afternoon, her car raising dust on the road. She filmed the dome, the family, and the oak tree that stood like a guardian beside them. When the segment aired on local television, the story of the family who built faith out of concrete became something larger than any of them had expected. With the attention came opportunity. A farmer from a nearby town visited, asking if Andrew could build him a small dome for storing grain. "It doesn't have to be fancy," the man said. "Just something that'll hold through the winter." Andrew hesitated at first. He didn't see himself as a business again, but Clara encouraged him. "It's work," she said softly, "and it's honest." They accepted. Together they drove to the farmer's land, sketching plans on the back of an old envelope, and within a month, the first commissioned dome stood in the middle of the field, strong and clean against the sky. When they returned home, Jake ran out to meet them, waving his camera in excitement. "You did it, Dad! Everyone's asking for more." And it was true. Emails came from people who wanted small homes, studios, shelters. Some offered money, others simply asked for guidance. Andrew began teaching what he knew, explaining how to mix and pour, how to respect the shape instead of fighting it. He didn't think of it as business. He thought of it as passing something on. Clara started helping design the interiors, her eye for light and space returning as naturally as breathing. She would walk around their dome in the evenings, placing candles where shadows gathered, saying, "Light has to travel too." The family's days changed rhythm again. Instead of survival, their work became creation. Andrew rose early, his tools lined neatly by the door. He taught Jake to measure angles, to balance a trowel, to listen for the sound of the mixture setting. Clara kept records, notes on materials, and sketches of their future. Slowly, the fear that had haunted them was replaced by quiet confidence. When Andrew looked at his son, he saw more than a boy. He saw a legacy taking shape, one that would outlast both of them. Neighbors who once pitied them now came seeking advice. Andrew built a small bench outside the dome where he would sit in the afternoons, explaining to newcomers how the design worked. "Concrete is heavy," he would say, "but faith is what holds it together." Jake filmed those moments, capturing his father's hands tracing the curves of the walls, the dust rising in the golden light. One evening, Clara watched the footage and smiled. "Do you see what you've done?" she said to Andrew. "You didn't just build a home, you built a way back." Inside, the dome began to change, too. Clara painted the walls in warm tones that softened the gray. Jake made shelves from leftover wood, lining them with books and small trinkets they'd kept through all the chaos. On one of the shelves, he placed the small camera that had started it all, calling it our lucky charm. The interior smelled faintly of paint and firewood, the air always a little cool, the light soft and forgiving. Each corner felt touched by care. The house had become more than structure. It was alive with memory. One evening, Andrew came home after visiting a new client and found Clara sitting by the fire outside, her face calm, her hands folded on her lap. "Do you remember?" she asked. "That night by the road, when we had nothing?" He nodded. "I remember every second of it." She looked toward the dome, glowing faintly in the starlight. "I thought we'd never feel whole again, but somehow we built something stronger than before." Her voice broke slightly, but not from sadness. "I think we built ourselves back." Andrew didn't answer right away. He reached for her hand and squeezed it gently, the firelight flickering across their fingers. Jake joined them, holding 3 mugs of warm tea. He sat between them and pointed at the house. "I think it likes us," he said sleepily. "It always sounds happy at night." Clara laughed softly. "Maybe it's just the wind." "No," Jake insisted. "It's the house." Andrew listened then, and for a moment, he thought he could hear it too. The faint, hollow hum of wind moving through the curved walls, rising and falling like breathing. Over the next months, they grew busier. More people came to learn, and Andrew found himself guiding groups through the property, explaining the philosophy behind their work. He called it building with patience. Sometimes he let Jake do the talking, watching proudly as his son spoke about their journey with clear, confident words. The boy who had once hidden behind the camera now stood tall before strangers, telling them how his parents turned loss into stone and stone into home. One afternoon, after everyone had left, Andrew walked around the dome and stopped near the back wall. The sunlight hit it at an angle, revealing faint handprints, places where Jake's fingers had pressed into wet cement months ago. He called Clara and Jake outside, and together they stood looking at them. "We should all leave our mark," Clara said suddenly. She dipped her hand in a bucket of fresh plaster and pressed it gently against the wall. The print stayed there, white and distinct. Jake followed, his smaller hand fitting beside hers. Then Andrew added his own, larger and rougher, completing the trio. They stepped back, looking at the 3 imprints glowing in the evening light. "Now it's truly ours," Clara said quietly. That night, as they sat by the fire, the dome behind them glowed like a lantern. The oak tree rustled gently in the breeze, its branches swaying as though applauding their perseverance. Andrew stared into the flames, the memories of the past months running through his mind, the truck they slept in, the rain that broke their first frame, the laughter that followed when they rebuilt it. He thought of the nights he'd doubted himself, the moments when Clara's strength had carried him, and the small voice of his son that had pulled him back from giving up. Every struggle was etched into the walls of that dome, invisible but eternal. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. "Do you think we'll stay here forever?" she asked. Andrew took a moment before answering. "Forever isn't the point," he said. "What matters is that we know how to start again, wherever we are." She smiled at that, her eyes reflecting the firelight. As the night deepened, Jake took his camera and began filming once more. He focused on the dome, the tree, the fire, and his parents beside him. His voice was quiet but sure. "This is the house my parents built when we had nothing," he said. "They thought it would be temporary, but maybe the best things are the ones you build when you're not planning to." Andrew turned to look at him, his chest tightening with pride. The boy lowered the camera and smiled. The moment felt still, suspended, as though the earth itself had paused to listen. Later, when the fire burned low and only the glow of the dome remained, Andrew stood and walked toward it. The walls shimmered faintly under the moonlight, their smooth curves reflecting every movement of the sky. He placed his hand over the fresh prints they'd made that evening and whispered, "We did it." Inside, the air was cool and silent. The dome, their home, their creation, stood firm. A monument not of wealth or skill, but of endurance. He returned to the fire where Clara and Jake were already dozing, their faces peaceful. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and leaves. Above them, the stars stretched endlessly, cold and brilliant. For the first time in a long time, Andrew felt no fear of tomorrow. He had seen what could be built from ruin, what faith could shape from dust. The world outside might still be uncertain, but within these walls, within this family, there was strength that no storm could break. As he drifted toward sleep, the dome loomed behind them, solid and gentle, its curved silhouette blending into the horizon. It would stand long after they were gone, a quiet testament to what could rise from loss when hearts refused to yield. And in that stillness, beneath the boundless night, the house of concrete and faith breathed softly, alive with everything they had poured into it. Hope, endurance, and love that no hand could ever tear down. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes that every home begins with faith.